Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first ever Stylus Zoom webinar. My name is Patty Webb, and I am the Marketing Manager for Stylus Publishing. This is the first webinar in our series to bring you direct access to our authors and crucial topics for today's higher education community. I'm happy to introduce authors Kevin Kelly and Todd Zakrajsek from our new book, Advancing Online Teaching, Creating Equity-Based Digital Learning Environments, forward by Michelle Bacansky-Brock and part of our Excellent Teacher book series. This book differs from online teaching books in that in the process of offering guidance and course design, developing outcomes and engaging activities, and managing the workload and assessments, the authors pay explicit attention to the distinct and diverse needs of students. They offer effective strategies in a comprehensive and inclusive way using the principles of universal design for learning. So welcome, Kevin and Todd.
Thanks, Patty. And Rachel, I caught your question, and it's one of the topics we're slated to cover, so bring it up again when we get there. All right.
That's good.
Well, so
as we move along, I guess we should say, Kevin, is to definitely put questions in chat if you have some questions. There's both the, so in the chat, do that. Okay,
and if
go
you
ahead.
use the hashtag #MyBigQ, that makes it easier for us to see. But if you don't, we'll still see the question mark and we'll figure it out. All right, so some of you submitted some questions in advance using the helpful form that the Stylus team put together. And so some of the overarching themes of those questions related to engaging students, especially today in the pandemic environment. How do we do it synchronously? How do we do it asynchronously? Some of you wanted to know about identifying skills, tools, and strategies that help people who are new to online teaching. And then as Rachel just put in the chat, how do you deal with the resistance that some faculty have to online teaching, even though they may be asked to do it during these times when campuses close and open on a regular basis? And they may be doing so not just for the pandemic, but the wildfires out here in California, hurricanes down in the Southeast, and any other number of reasons. And last but not least, because it's a core theme of our book, some of you asked about increasing learning equity for online learners. So we're going to start some of our dialogue, and we do mean this to be a dialogue, not a monologue, or we're going to start with these 4 categories of questions. But like I said, as you come up with your own questions, pop them in the chat and we'll tackle them. You ready to go, Todd?
Good.
All right. So Todd, why don't you kick us off with some ideas about how we can engage students today?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And again, thank you all for joining us here today. This is really exciting. First thing I'd just like to mention is for engaging students, I think it's really, really important that anytime we do any kind of engagement or activities, that we anchor it on learning theory. We know some things about learning theory that really work. We know that repetition is important. And do it in such a ways that students don't get boring. So we have multiple ways of doing that. We know getting and maintaining attention, absolutely critical for the learning environment. We know that practicing at retrieval is really important. So again, that comes into the repetition. We practice recalling information from memory. It becomes easier to recall it. Pretty soon you've got who is the first president, and boom, you've got a name right there because first president, Washington have gone together so many times. So when we want to do engaging techniques and online and asynchronous, on both synchronous and asynchronous environments, we want to make sure we're still anchoring on some kind of learning theory. So that's where I want to start. I'm just going to mention a couple of examples. Kevin can jump in with some others, but I think one of the things you do is really, in looking at it, identify the crux of what you're trying to achieve in a face-to-face environment, and then look at how you can adapt it for online. Or if you're teaching online and never teach online, what is the thing you're trying to achieve? So for instance, in a class, let's start with a face-to-face class. If I want to call on my students, why are you calling on students? Multiple reasons to call on students. We've run into some pretty sad situations. I had a teacher one time that a faculty member, and I asked him, why do you call on students? Just curious. He says, well, I catch the ones that are sleeping. And I said, well, what are you trying to catch them with? He said, well, I just catch them and I ask them a question, and when they're embarrassed, they realize they shouldn't be dozed off or not paying attention. And so that's a terrible reason to call on students. And so if you think through it, if you want to call on students to check for understanding, to see if they're getting it, in a class, you can do that. In a synchronous environment, you can certainly call on students. In an asynchronous environment, if you want to check and see how they're doing, you can email them. So the emailing would be kind of the proxy for calling on them. If you want to have your students introduce themselves, so you have more community in class, there again is what I'm anchoring on. We know that community is a real good thing for learning. In a classroom environment, I might call on my students. In a synchronous environment, I might also call on my students, but an asynchronous environment, I might use Flipgrid. Flipgrid is a great little program where students can videotape themselves, and you decide how long they can be, anywhere from 30 seconds to 10 minutes, and they post them. They're posted in such a way that it's very easy for other students to then watch those videos and get to know them. So again, that's another way to engage your students in an asynchronous class, is by using Flipgrid. So the point of those is that there's lots of ways of doing this. You can do Kahoot in an asynchronous environment. It's a different format than you do in the synchronous, but it's Kahoot, and they can go online and take a quiz. You can do Dyad, you can do 1-minute threads, which Kevin came up instead of 1-minute papers. So there's lots of ways to engage students. And in the book, there's tons of examples on how to do this. So I'm going to stop there. Kevin, if you want to add anything, you can, and then we'll proceed.
I'm going to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. So building on what Todd just mentioned, I think some of the practicalities are, some of us who've been doing synchronous sessions may have faced where we're one of the only videos that's on. And then you see a field of black squares with white names written across them. In some cases, you might have students who've uploaded a picture. And I would say that's okay, because we want to respect the fact that some students are in living situations that they don't want to share with others. They may be, they may have their own challenges. I recently learned about students who have possibly body image challenges, that when they see themselves on camera and they don't know how to turn off their own view, that could cause stress for them. So how do we make sure that they're not just doing something else in the background? Well, a strategy that we can pull from in-person teaching into our synchronous learning online is the idea of having a stack of 3x5 cards with each student's name on it. And then just saying, hey, I've got this stack, and whoever's on top, when it comes time for me to ask a question, I'm going to call in the name at the very top. And that person can either use chat, they can use voice, or they can use their camera if they want to turn it on, if they're comfortable with that. But it's what Tom Angelo used to call a positive sense of anxiety, where students know that they may be called upon, so they are prepared and they are paying attention. And if they run into trouble, which is part of the learning process, we don't always get it right on the first try, you can treat it like that old show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and have them phone a friend. Who's that? That's the next person in the stack. And so you can use some playful ways to engage the students in the process. Jeffrey jumped to something I was going to bring up, and he beat me to the punch, that we want to basically set the expectations ahead of time, and if possible, create community norms collaboratively, perfect, and also start with some easier activities where people are more motivated to participate. Why are you interested in this class type conversations, as opposed to, did you understand James Joyce Ulysses page 395? And so giving them a chance to get used to the idea, something that they're going to do on a regular basis, starting that at the very beginning of the semester, if it's synchronous or asynchronous, starting with those lighter activities to get students used to the protocol, because you've got your ideas of how you're going to engage students, but many of those students are taking classes from multiple other instructors who all have different ideas of how they're going to engage students. So students are learning new rules all the time. And if we can set up some sort of, again, as Jeffrey brings up in the chat, community norms and ways to help students establish the ways of interaction. And last but not least, what our friend Marianne Winklemis and her colleagues at the Transparency in Learning and Teaching project would say is providing the rationale. why are we doing this? What's the purpose? So that students can see that this isn't just having interactivity for interactivity's sake, but it's meant to drive them towards a specific learning outcome. It's meant to get them ready for some real world interactions. I'm working right now with St. George's University in Grenada, and they're thinking about how they can create the engagement opportunities for students in the School of Medicine to practice being on rounds with other doctors. When they're making the rounds with the patients, they need to have those conversations about the status of the patient. They're going to use the chat and the camera as a way to mimic that experience, so that they're not just having engagement for engagement's sake, but what types of things would you bring up in this particular real world case? And so these are just a few ideas. Obviously, there's plenty more. Todd brought up some great tools that you can use as well. Flipgrid is one that I use, and that follows a universal design for learning practice, where I allow students to either type in their response in the discussion forum via text, or share a link to a Flipgrid video that's automatically captioned by the software. And so now we're giving students choice in the way that they present their ideas to their colleagues. Todd, I see you have your hand up, and I think it's time for me to stop talking. And you're on mute.
Boy, that's something that my friends are going to miss when the COVID stuff is gone. We're all face to face, is the mute button for Todd. So, so I really want to mention quickly too, is that I loved when you started talking about the screens being on and off, and there's huge discussions in higher education about that. But I also like to just look at things from different perspectives. Keep in mind, folks, that even if an instructor requires the students have their screens on, you don't know for sure what you're going to get, because if you have more than a few and the students are in those little boxes all over, this is something I learned from the students. So just be ready to have your mind blown for just a second. I want you to prepare yourself. And this is what I learned from a student. See if I can get this to work. Oh no, it didn't come on. There it is. There it is. You see, that's me with a little recording. And so if that were in a little box amongst 30 or 40 students, I'm not sure you'd ever catch that was me. Oh, let's just get back here like this. And so there I am coming back into my session. And the point is, it's kind of humorous, but the argument there is, just because you force them to have the screens on doesn't mean you're looking at the students. So it's something to keep in mind.
That's brilliant.
The office. All right.
Now, while we're on the topic of engagement, Melissa in the Q&A section asked if there are strategies that work better for graduate students and adult learners that may be distinct from those that serve traditional undergraduate age students. So I would say, well, first and foremost, graduate students are more experienced learners. And so even though they may not need the rationale as much as, let's say, a first generation, first year student, you still want to provide those additional aspects of structure. When you're going to have breakout rooms, Todd pointed out a really important aspect of our courses is that we're trying to create an element of community within the group of students that are participating in the class. So allowing them some free space to have conversations that may or may not relate to class, but giving them a specific deliverable so that when they come back to the whole group, that they've accomplished the task you want them to accomplish. But in terms of what you might expect from graduate students or more mature adult learners, I would say the differences really relate to the depth that you might be able to achieve in a shorter amount of time. So asking them to maybe move higher up in Bloom's taxonomy, or if you're thinking of a psychomotor or affective domain objective or outcome, we call them outcomes in the book, then you might be, again, able to achieve some application level or even some synthesis level activities in shorter amounts of time. And I know right now some of the biggest challenges for engagement relate to courses that have material that usually requires a hands-on experience. Clinical, again, activities for health professionals, things like welding for career and technical education. Those are things that are difficult to pull off in these synchronous online environments. So you may need to move to asynchronous, where students are able to try something out and react and film themselves in the process of performing a task, and then submitting that for feedback from their fellow students. So there are different ways to create asynchronous activities from things that might be synchronous and vice versa. And in some of your cases, you might even be using a hybrid or hybrid flexible format, in which case using the same tool for both groups, the synchronous group and the asynchronous group, helps you manage the whole thing. See, we're getting more questions in the chat, and so maybe it's time to see what they're asking. And
it was Linda asking a question about groups being either fixed groups or random groups or some combination, which Brett already jumped in and has a great answer for. And I was just typing also. Brett mentioned this. Randomizing is usually good for one-off activities, fixed groups, something that carries across meetings. Yeah, typically and Brett, that's great, because that's exactly what I was going to say is, if I'm going to use, if I want an intact group, you're really looking at community and building this trust and cooperation amongst a group that's going to be happening through a quarter, through the semester, through the period of time. If I want students to work on something very quickly, I often will use quick random groups. Quick random groups allow students to work with more individuals, of course, throughout the class. It allows you to learn different styles and see how people work and mix things up a bit. Fixed groups, if you're going to keep the group together, is going to be more of that community-based thing. So it keeps coming back to, I think, first of all, outline what do you want to accomplish with groups, and then identify the type of groups that will best deliver that for you. So I guess coming back to Steve Ehrman mentioned high impact practices previously. Things like first year experiences and writing intensive courses all are under that high impact practices, service learning, internships. If you look at how the community is being built, and again, a lot of times those actually work better with fixed groups for developing community. Great question.
Absolutely. And I teach a class that ranges from 50 to 100 students every semester, and it's always been online since 2008. And so one of the strategies that I do is I create, every 3 weeks, we have a new module that I call a quest. And the small groups are fixed. They travel throughout the entire semester. So they have a group of students with whom they can connect and get to know well. Those students that they can text when they forget what the assignment is. They build a relationship with someone, which we are hearing from students. They really crave that ability to, when they're sitting next to someone in a desk, they can turn to the person they're always sitting next to and ask them a question. So giving them that space to create those connections. But I also have more optional groups where they basically can join in with small groups for those one-off activities, as Brett brought up, and Todd as well, to allow them to have that diversity of thinking throughout the term. So I would say we've covered groups quite a bit. We've got a great group here. What else do we have here? Shin Lee talks about, has anybody encountered the situation when halfway through the semester, one or two group members start collaborating or working, and then what happens next? So one of the things that I try to do for the group work that I assign is not make any group members responsible for other group members' contributions. So this points that students earn in the group work is for the work that they contribute. And if the group contributes everything that needs to be done to finish the product or process or project, then great. Then maybe there's an opportunity for bonus points or something like that. But we know that based on our lives, and especially right now, students are taking care of their own children while they're studying. They're taking care of senior parents, perhaps, or other relatives that may need support. They're possibly working. I've had essential workers in my class that are working 2 shifts a day. And so they can't participate at the same levels as everybody else. And so recognizing that, what I've tried to do is create opportunities for smaller numbers of people to achieve the goal of the group. So typically in asynchronous activities, a good number, and we have this in the book, is around 8 to 10 is probably the maximum size for an effective small group for asynchronous activities. And for small group activities that are synchronous, you might be thinking like a breakout or something like that, and maybe you'll have 3, 4, or 5 people in those breakouts. And so when you have what they call social loafers in the old world, or now just people who choose not to or are not able to participate in that particular activity, then creating a space for those students to let their teammates know. And that's what it gets back to those norms, the collaboration norms that Jeffrey brought up earlier, is making sure that there's a communication channel within the group. So if you're using a tool like Moodle or other learning management system, make sure they have that opportunity to email each other within the group so that they can let the students know, hey, I'm working this week. I'm not going to be able to participate in our group meeting that we've set up for Wednesday at 3. And so that will allow the other group members to flex and accomplish the task. And if there's ways for them to do it asynchronously, make their contributions either in advance because they know they're going to be busy, or after the fact because they just got caught up with life, then you're giving them the space to do that.
So I love that answer, Kevin. I think that's really good because it is a pro-student approach. I mean, what I hear Kevin talk about all the time, I love this, is that when something's not going well, it's like it potentially just something in their life. They want to contribute, they just can't right now. So I think that's really important. Anton just put in the chat too that he has a process by which essentially students can be fired from groups. And my background's industrial psychology. I've done this for years. I really believe education and all the different aspects of education is to help teach students or help them to learn skills that they can use throughout life. And quite frankly, if you go out and get a job and you're on a work team and you're not producing, you can get fired. So I like what Anton put in there for students in my class. They can always fire a classmate, but they have to go through the same kinds of steps as that we'd have to go through in industry. Is, number one, there has to be a verbal warning. Hey, Kevin, I noticed that you haven't been able to be in class lately. I haven't gotten this done. After the verbal warning has to also be told to the instructor, to me. Then there's a written warning. And then there's basically a meeting with the individual. And so we go through these steps so that someone's just not kicked out, but are held accountable. But the other one I want to throw in there, and then we probably should move on from groups, is the research I've looked at is if you teach students how to work well in groups, they tend to do a whole lot better than if we just assign them in groups, whether online or face-to-face. So if there are things like students not contributing halfway through the semester, we always have the people who do too much, the people who do not do enough. So you got your hogs and your logs. We talk through what that means. If you're not going to be able to keep up your end, make sure you communicate that with your group in advance so you don't kind of catch them off guard at the last second. So teach them how to work in groups, hold them accountable, and all the things that Kevin just said too in terms of helping them to be successful in the groups. So excellent stuff.
And just to finish that thought, I love hogs and logs. You can tell you're in North Carolina. The concept of having a peer-based evaluation as a part of the group process, so that basically you can say if there's 4 people in each group, there is a total of 40 points or 100 points, let's say, and each student gets to give out 25 points. And so they can give them to themselves, to the other students, but there's a way to identify the students who have earned fewer points from their colleagues as a small percentage of that group work. And others who have done more will earn possibly even bonus points because they've been rewarded by their peers who recognize that they really helped the team get through a tough spot when nobody else could participate. And there's some good stuff online about that.
Yeah.
So as Todd mentioned, let's move on from engaging students. And it's not the last time we need to talk about it, but there's plenty more that you have questions about. And so the next is different skills, tools, and strategies that you might use as part of the online teaching process. And Todd's added this nice little subtext here. Don't overwhelm yourself or your students. If you're new to online teaching, I love the concept that another author who writes about UDL, Tom Tobin, brings up. It's called +1 thinking. What's one thing that you're going to use this semester? What's one tool, one learning strategy that you're going to use throughout the term in the quarter or semester system to engage students, to assess student learning, or to provide students with an opportunity to review course content. And so those different tools and strategies are going to differ based on your outcomes and what you want students to be able to do or know at the end. But that's a good place to start, is the outcomes themselves. And what's nice about the way we framed the book is we've captured it in the back in an appendix, the entire list of tools related to the different strategies that we recommend, whether it be something that I brought up earlier, Flipgrid as a way to use different communication channels for students to practice universal design for learning as they communicate with one another and the instructor. Or let's say using something again that allows for both synchronous and asynchronous contributions. If you're going to have a hybrid flexible course, or just recognizing those students who have other responsibilities or priorities. So Poll Everywhere. You can have every student that's in your class meeting use Poll Everywhere to reply to your prompts on a regular basis to keep them engaged. Usually the general thinking is having every 10 or 12 minutes some way for students to interact in a live situation. So it's not a sit and listen, but it's a participation. But then that same Poll Everywhere, make sure you choose the setting that allows for students to make contributions or submissions after the live meeting, and then take it upon yourself as the instructor, or create it as a small group leader activity to sum up what was the final count. If the class is on Monday and you're giving people till Tuesday at midnight West Coast time to make their contributions, then send out a little note saying, hey, here's the final tally. It's kind of like what we're seeing in the country, where the election happens, but tallies fill in as the votes are mailed in. So we can do it in our classes. Todd, what are some things that you've pulled out from how we share how to identify skills, tools, and strategies to use in your online classes?
Yeah, again, I liked what you just said, Kevin. I think this is number one, making sure that, again, it's not going to overwhelm your students. I've spent my whole career just trying to be whelmed. You know, I don't want to be overwhelmed. I don't want to be underwhelmed. I just want to be whelmed. I learned that from Lori Richland. I think she did a conference session one time, how to just be whelmed. But there are so many tools out there now. So there's, I believe, if I recall correctly, there's 66 educational tools we list in the book of different ways of doing this. Kevin and I have both mentioned Flipgrid, just a really interesting, neat way to do it. Edpuzzle is fabulous. Edpuzzle lets you take clips, the videos that are, video clips are out there in the internet, anywhere out there, and then you can add questions, comments, voiceovers to them. There's just so many different things you can do though. So I think that doing them, I guess what I want to point out is be careful. There's this whole idea of cognitive load and repetition kinds of, the more we do something, the easier it becomes, which makes the process easier overall. That's why the things you do very frequently are very easy. You turn into what psychologists call automaticity. It just becomes automatic that you do it. Going out and getting in your car, you walk out, you get in your car, you close the door, you put it in gear, start the car, put it in gear, go. You don't actually think through, it's time to start the car. It's time to put it in reverse. It's time to hit the gas. It's time to hit the brake. They become automatic. As you come up with tools and strategies in your classes, whether they're online, face-to-face, hybrid, whatever they are, the things that become very, very easy for you seem very simple. And we oftentimes forget that for somebody else who hasn't gone through that process, there's a lot of actual cognitive load and a lot of work to do it. So the types of tools, the types of things we ask our students to do, just keep in mind which ones are new for them. And the point here is, don't do a whole bunch of things, because to you it may look like it's exciting and fun, but to the other side, to the students, it may look like it's just chaotic. So I just leave it with that.
Not only that, but the surveys that we've seen last spring and summer and even into fall of students' experience during COVID-19 is that the more tools that they're asked to use, the more difficult it is for them. So it might even be beneficial to talk to your colleagues in your department if you're working with students in your major to identify what your colleagues are doing, so that across the entire spectrum, you're using a smaller number of tools. Jeffrey asked a great question about students complaining that they're working harder now that they have more online experiences. And in some ways, that's technically true, because Last spring and summer, we had a huge professional development push that asked faculty members to learn more about online teaching. And in that process, they gained these ideas for student-centered learning practices that do engage students more than they would in a normal lecture where they're sitting, maybe having a think, pair, share or something like that, but a higher concentration of activity than just straight lecture than they're used to experiencing. And if they're not good at time management, which is a critical skill for online learners, especially when we talk about self-directed learning skills, we need to help students start setting aside the time they need for the asynchronous stuff and also being ready for when they show up for the synchronous stuff, so that it's not a constant hop from one thing to another, having to figure things out on the fly. The cognitive load that Todd was talking about earlier is not only with respect to the content, but with respect to the tools that they're using. We have some returning students who may not be as familiar with some of the technologies, including Zoom or the learning management system. So as we start having people bounce from tool A to tool B, it might be easy for us because we've gotten a chance to practice with instructional designers or just have been doing it for 10 or 12 years. Like I've been teaching online since 2007 or 8. And so those types of things we need to take into consideration, that everybody's at a different level, giving people those opportunities to practice so that they're not trying a technology during a high stakes exam or project. And then finally, thinking about how we can streamline our courses, because if it's true that all the instructors are increasing the amount of activity and engagement to make sure that we create that sense of community and everything else, we can create burnout in our students who are already, it's shown since April or March of last year, higher levels of anxiety and stress. And that's going to increase their cognitive load because they're not going to be able to focus as well. So really making sure that we think about what is it that students need to know to meet the learning outcomes, and then what are some nice things to know, and set those aside in a folder called "If You Want to Learn More." And so that way students have an element of choice. If they're ahead of the rest of the class, they can dive into those extra materials because they have the time and interest. But if you're trying to make sure students are able to get from point A to point B with a passing grade or the grade that they want, then creating that pathway for them as well.
Excellent. There's a lot of discussion going on the side. Sorry, we're not going to be able to catch everything for timing and stuff. Let's see, Ruth Ann did mention there was a good book that's out, Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. That's a great book with some good references there. Jeffrey did ask if there's data on average time needed to process a specific duration of video content. That's really tricky because it's so heavily dependent on what the video content is and what the prior experience is for the students. So I don't know of a specific study for that, but again, I've seen some studies that start looking at video content and processing. But again, when you really start breaking down prior knowledge, just a really quick example is prior knowledge. If you have prior knowledge in an area and I'm watching a video, it's very easy to accommodate and assimilate the new information from the video into the framework that I already have. For somebody that doesn't have the prior knowledge, it's a tremendous amount of work. So I might be able to watch very easily something in psychology that's 2 hours long and just get it. And somebody else may have to stop the video after every 3 or 4 minutes and process like crazy. So again, I don't know what the specific information is, but I do think we, if nothing else, need to be mindful of the processing that's necessary for a novice to then gather the information. I did want to mention too quickly with Kevin talking about the whole concept of time with students and moving to more student-centered. Please do keep that strongly in mind. If we have a teaching-centered approach, I lecture, you listen, you jot down some notes, you go off and study, you come back, take a test. There's a certain amount of work that goes with that. If we're now going to have a discussion so that we can look at deeper ideas and really get to some meaning of what's going on, that's additional work. And as we do that more and more, we're creating more and more work for the students. At UNC, the medical school moved to a flipped model for teaching medical school. And I was part of the initial stages of this. And one of the things I said as we were laying things out is I said to the committee, when are the students going to do the work to prepare for class? And they said, well, before class. I said, let's map that out. So we put the 168-hour grid across there of midnight to midnight, 7 days a week. said, okay, well, on Monday morning, if they're going to be doing this, they could prepare it for like on, because you're supposed to have some time off on the weekend, but we'll say Sunday night. But if they move right from small groups into a lab situation, well, then that means they'd have to prepare for the lab situation and get ready for that also on Sunday night. And if they move from the lab then to a clinic situation, well, they'd have to prepare for that as well. So they could do that on Friday, except on Friday, they're in clinic all day. So I guess they could do it Thursday. And it really turned out to be a very eye-opening exercise that if we're going to require the students to do all these things, we need to make sure that there's times for them to be done.
And one way that I help structure that, because my class is an undergraduate lower division general education course. And so what I do is I break my activities into chunks, and I use a tool called Todoist, which is an online to-do list. And then they basically give students recommendations for when they should start activities, how long it might take them to complete the reading portion of an activity, the original post of a discussion forum, the replies to other students with concrete instructions for how to give a solid reply as opposed to good job smiley face, and much more. And so giving students that structure if they need it. Some advanced learners, and this is again back to that point that Melissa brought up in the Q&A, graduate students may be more attuned to that time management aspect and won't need that guidance. But for first generation, first year students, then you might need to give them some support in creating a calendar for themselves with reminders of when they should start, not just when they should turn in certain activities. And then to the point about the length on videos, the one thing that I would say, and again, knowing what we know about human attention, cognitive load, and all that, is that even if you're going to make a long video, and I am about to do this for a training for faculty, I've got 60 minutes of video, but every 5 to 7 minutes, I'm actually going to say, now press pause and do this on your worksheet. When you're done, come back and press play, and I'll tell you what I put on my worksheet, and you can compare it to what you wrote. And so that way you're giving them these breaks to work with the material. Even if it's a live situation, you can engage students in some sort of activity. It could be even just putting a slide with a question on it and not even asking them to answer in the chat, because that, as soon as we see a question, we're going to be actively engaged as opposed to sitting passively. Todd has a great book about dynamic lecturing. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about how students are processing the information they're taking in so it doesn't go out the other side. All right, so, and Jeffrey wants to see an example of my Todoist. I can make that happen. It probably won't be this second, but I will make sure it goes in what they call the show notes. Shinli was asking about the chat, and we're going to save that and save it with the recording. So I'll just make sure that example Todoist file is in there. And I just, out of my own money, I paid that $29 a month, because that allows me to take my Todoist list and then create a copy and give it to my students so that they can mark off their items individually if they choose to use that. And it's, again, giving students structure. Sometimes it's a matter of just telling them to put it in their Google Cal or iCal or their paper-based calendar and taking a picture of it.
And before we forget here, because you mentioned Shinli was asking about the materials here, I'm not sure on everybody's view, but I think it's there where you start typing your message, there should be the box with the 3 dots, and there's an option right there to save the chat. So not just for today, but anytime you're in a meeting or anything else with Zoom, if you want to save the chat, you click the button and it'll download chat for you right onto your desktop.
Right above where you type your message. Yep. Oh, that's a good point, Shinli. It might be that this is a webinar and that may not be activated for the participants.
All right.
All right. Well, duly noted. And again, we're going to save the chat. So one of the reasons why we like the hashtags, because it allows us to scrape it and make a summary. All right. So the next topic that was raised, both beforehand and with some of the questions in the chat, is how do you deal with the resistance of some faculty to the concept of online teaching? And so we start with what we know to be true about what Rogers called the adoption curve of innovation. And so here's a graphic by the MindWires group that characterizes this as a group of people as opposed to just a traditional bell curve. But there is what's called a chasm in between those early adopters and the rest of the people who are adopting a specific practice or technology. And so we do know that in March, April, a lot of our colleagues who had never taught online before were asked to jump in feet first, sometimes head first into the deep end with no training whatsoever. And it may be something they were choosing not to do. It could be something they were actively avoiding. But the case is that we needed to support students completing their educational goals. And for those people who say education as a whole does not move very quickly, I challenge them to think that way after what happened in the spring, where we made a rapid transition from face-to-face classes to what some have been calling emergency remote teaching and learning. And we can definitely talk about the differences between that emergency remote teaching and learning and online teaching and learning. But for our students, they're going online and they're having an experience, and they're hoping for us to be supporting them in their space. And so when we get to addressing the resistance of those faculty, not just now when we're in this kind of moment of urgency and emergency, but also later when we may go back to whatever the new normal might seem. Having online components to our classes increases the flexibility for our students who, again, are different than what we might have experienced when we were students, what our ideal learning experience might be. It's different now. And so getting to the heart of any resistance usually involves asking those faculty members to start seeing the world through their students' eyes. So one thing that I often say in workshop situations is try doing what you are asking your students to do using only your smartphone, because there are at least 25% of our students right now do not have reliable access to the internet on a regular basis. We have students that are driving to parking lots to get internet from McDonald's and Starbucks, Wi-Fi by parking lot proximity. There are another group of students who don't have reliable access to a computer. They may be in a multi-person household with stay-at-home orders. They're competing for time on a computer with working adults, with siblings who are in K-12 or higher ed themselves, and just the needs can be greater than the number of devices in the house. And so needing to, again, thinking about equity and the concept of access, how are we going to support those students? It becomes a challenge. And so getting those faculty members who are resistant to online teaching to see the world through their student lens can help them at least acknowledge the way the world is and address what their students need, maybe in their own way as opposed to the ways that are being promoted. But we definitely have plenty of research that shows the effectiveness of online teaching. We have plenty of stories from colleagues, and Jennifer brings up, if they refuse to view through that lens, then there may be more to the resistance than just needing more information. And so it may require a deeper conversation to identify what the biggest barriers are, whether they are, I just don't want to do this, or something else. And if that's a tough conversation to have, or it's just there's not enough time when you're supporting hundreds, if not thousands of instructors, and you have one instructor who's having a challenge, then you may pull in others to help with the conversation. Todd, I know you've been doing this a long time. What would you recommend for this situation?
Thanks, Kevin. That's great. And I would recommend first reading Steve's article for distance learning. He put it in the chat there. Steve Ehrman, and he's written some great stuff. But this was a great one. It was Distance Learning, Why Faculty Resist. I pulled it up real quickly. It's from 2011. I mean, so this is an issue that's been around for a while. It was around way before 2011. But even again, about 10 years ago, Steve was writing on this concept. I think it's really important first, and Kevin already mentioned the differentiation between online teaching and emergency remote instruction. If you haven't seen the article in EduCause, I will go ahead and paste it over here in the chat so you can have that. Don't go off and read these things right now. That's, it's multitasking. Gotta be careful with that. But the big one is just, there's nothing new to higher education or teaching ever, to having the resistance to teaching, both to online teaching, the resistance to more student engagement, a student focused teaching. Was resistance to Blackboard and to course management systems when they first came out. When I was working at Central Michigan University and Blackboard was really just emerging, we had our history department. 0 people in the history department was using Blackboard when about 70% of the campus was using it. And they just said, I went and talked to them and they just said, we've never needed it. We don't need it. We're not going to do it. And so this overcoming resistance, I don't think is not only new to online teaching, but it's just not unique. So I think then there's just strategies. There's some individuals, as Kevin was pointing out, who are just really resistant to this. And I don't like to think of them definitely as Luddites or people who don't care or anything else. There's a lot of reasons for a person not to move into a new area, and fear can be right at the top of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so just to be cautious of that, but also look for resources and do it. There was one, I didn't actually end up writing the article, but I talked about it a lot of time when we were working with some Merlot projects. It was the concept of perceived hassles. And the idea I was trying to pull together there was what types of things we don't do because of a perception of a hassle that may or may not even exist. So for instance, for the old folks in the room, when we first started moving from acetates to PowerPoint, I mean, remember all the times that we would actually go to conferences and we would take a full set of acetates with us because, that LCD projector the bulb would burn out, they can't replace the bulb, it's just going to be a problem dealing with it. I'm going to take my acetates and just go that way, even when it was available because of my perception of what was going to go wrong. And so I think that's just an area to move into, but otherwise, Kevin, you covered that really well.
Well, and I think one other strategy that people like Jennifer, who I totally feel the pain you have in addressing the needs of those students who are complaining, is maybe if you can identify the root of it, like the workload management or the fear, as Todd mentioned, of looking like you're not in control when you're used to 20 plus years of being the person in front of a room who has everything together, is maybe finding a way for that instructor to engage the students in some of the activities that are the most stressful. Like, hey, can you monitor the chat during this synchronous thing? Because I really want to give a lecture. Or finding ways that there are support cast members, so to speak, that would be able to increase the way that students can learn. And it seems like Jennifer's bringing up that it's not necessarily not teaching online, but not teaching online with research-based strategies or something like that. So,
yeah. Well, we're
definitely,
Kevin. So I do want to touch because Philip just pointed out there too some issues or practices that paid particular attention to anti-racism or equity in the marginalized student groups. And so, given we only got about 5 minutes, we should chat quickly because that's a huge aspect of the book.
yes.
And we've got these in an order now. In hindsight, I wish we would have flipped them because we did have a bunch of group time for the other ones, which I like, but this one is so important and we're down to just a couple of minutes. So we can talk about these quickly, but Kevin has a fabulous perspective on equity.
Well, and so we've talked about universal design for learning a bit. And one of the things that I've done in the work with different colleges and universities around the country, and especially a community college district in Oakland, California, is there's a lot of research out there about the equity-based challenges that students face, and the way that some people are defining equity in that group is freedom from assumptions, biases, and institutional barriers that negatively impact students' motivation, opportunity, or achievement or accomplishment. So when we start thinking in terms of how do we remove those barriers so that all students can succeed in our classes, there's a heavy lean on universal design for learning, but then there are other aspects of equity that we can pull into the fold. For example, we've already talked about how universal design for learning might ask us to have multiple formats of a material and ask students to engage with each other using multiple communication channels. The next step on an equity side to make the content more meaningful to the students and address potential biases is to include multiple perspectives. So one thing that I do in my own class is I have students who are learning how to learn with their mobile devices, as they originally would only look at Carol Dweck's growth mindset concept and analyze themselves. They do a self check-in and see where they fall on the spectrum. But now I include J. Luke Wood's perspective on the growth mindset, Angela Lee Duckworth's perspective on, and Anindya Kundu's perspective on student agency as ways to look at different perspectives on what helps students internally with their learning processes. And so we have had some fantastic conversations in my class about growth mindset that we didn't have when we only showed one perspective, and it's a more equitable framing of the concept so that students can see themselves in the picture. Todd, what are some things about equity that we talk about in the book that you'd like to touch on?
Given the time, I'm just so sorry we don't have some more time to really do this. I think one of there's so many resources also we try to get in there. One of them that I really love is just making the representation of the images that you present in class. I mean, so many times we have the slides, and if you Getty Images, I just absolutely love that site now. And Getty will allow you, they're free to use, but you can actually then break it down and you can put in categories and say, I want groups of 3, I want women, I want East Asia as the ethnic group, or I want Black, African American, or I want whatever you, so the point is you can actually break it down so that you can find images that represent different groups in the classroom so that the students see themselves in these roles. So I'd love to show you the slides, but we've only got 2 minutes left and just want to finish with what the book's contents are. But I guess that's just it for now. There are some really good books. Could we put a book that we'd recommend? Not off the top of my head, but there's lots of them. There's several books that I've read about STEM education and women's STEM education, underrepresented groups. And so there's some good ones out there. So sorry for this. We're going to have to take off for there, but we've got 2 minutes left. Kevin, if we can go to skip that one. I just wanted to point out real quickly for the book, a couple of points that we had in there. We did want to make sure that there was a UDL approach and equity aspects, and also having that human connection, remembering the students are there. But each chapter we put next steps in. So if you are using this book for a class, you can have the students do the next steps as a faculty member reading it. Each one is, here's a chapter with the material, here's some action items for you. And in addition to that, we put in reflection and discussion questions in each chapter again to help with book groups and just to also reflect on the material. So those are included in the book. And that was from before too, as mentioned, 66 educational technologies kind of sprinkled throughout the book with a list in the back. Kevin, we got 1 minute. Anything else you want to say?
Well, yeah, some people might say, hey, there are a lot of books out there that talk about online teaching, and that's true, and they're all fantastic. What makes ours different is that we did use those 3 ways of looking at the world as the foundation for not just where do you click and why do you click, but want to make sure that UDL, design for learning equity and human connectedness, are at the heart of what we do. And also, very few of the online teaching books out there cover the extent of the online course process, not just designing them, but addressing accessibility, facilitating those courses once the students show up, assessing learning, evaluating our courses both while we're teaching it and after the fact. How do we support students, especially today? And how do we manage our workload? Because right now I'm reading a book called Burnout, and I'm finding that everything resonates very much. So I know many of you are in the same boat, and I hope that we can all make it through this storm together.
We'll make it through. Pathological levels of optimism, but so we're going to turn it back to Patty here to be respectful of people's time, and I think we finished on time.
All right, thank you, Todd and Kevin, for such an awesome webinar. And thank you everybody who tuned in live for us this afternoon. If you're interested in ordering online or advancing online teaching, you can use code ETS30 to get 30% off the book and free shipping from Stylus. I've put that information in the sidebar as well. This is just the first of our webinar series. The webinar video replay will be available tomorrow, and we will share it on all of our Stylus social media feeds. If you have any feedback from this webinar, if you have any requests for other topics to be discussed in future webinars, please feel free to email us directly at stylusinfo@styluspub.com. So thank you all again. Have a great afternoon. I will hang out a little bit longer so that way you all can save your chats and save any links that you'd like to do some further research on. And if you need anything, please let us know. Thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon.